So, I made it back from what one might consider to be an impassable problem, but I'm pretty clever. So the fuel float in my car, this is carbureted. This is a 1980 Volvo 240 wagon. It's a carbureted engine with the SUHIF6, but I've got an electric fuel pump in it, which might have just been the saving grace. Today I fired the car up and noticed it was running a little rich. And sometimes things are just a little bit sticky or hysteretic or whatever, and I'm used to that. But as I drove, it got richer and richer and richer to the point where it would almost wouldn't run, and I'm downshifting and I'm really nursing it along. And the thing I noticed more than anything else is the following distances of people behind me were unheard of, like 15 seconds. So you know right away, you smell bad. You smell so bad, people's eyes are bleeding. So it's running acrid rich. And so as I get down, and I had to meet a customer on time, and I really want to make sure that this happens. And I'm thinking, all right, I'm pretty sure the float ruptured. It's probably filling up with gasoline as I drive. And I get there, and of course, I just barely made it in, and I'm just puking out fumes and shit getting through the parking lot. And, everybody's kind of looking, and the car is running like a turd. And get my appointment done and chat for about half an hour, 40 minutes, have lunch, and so on. I'm starving on the way down, too, so that didn't help. And I go to fire, I'm like, I'm not going to even make it home. Fire the car up. It'll barely run. I mean, I got to keep it floored to get it to idle. And I'm thinking, fuck, I can't drive it like this. And it's 2 o'clock, busy traffic. No way I'm trying that. I'm thinking, I don't want to walk all the way up here. That's going to be 3 hours of walking just to come and get up a few carburetor parts and walk down. And I'm sitting and I'm thinking, you know what? If I could just turn the pump on and off while I'm driving, I could probably do okay. It would suck, but I could do it. But how will I do that? And then it dawns on me that I've added this switch, this guy here, to a, and I'll come out and show you what I've got. In the carburetor, I've added a valve for idling the carburetor up. Idling the engine, I should say. If you can get a carburetor to idle, let me know. You'll win a prize. These engines have anti-run-on valves. That's this thing here. This sticks into the manifold, and it just provides a throttle plate bypass for fuel air charge to go in. And the idea is that whenever the engine's on, key is on, that thing is open, and it's providing enough air for idle through the idle circuit. And you can see the idle speed adjustment screw right next to it. That's part of the same circuit. The idea being that on a hot engine, if you've just been pulling a trailer up a hill or whatever, you could have carbon flash in the combustion chambers, deposits, sharp edges of spark plug electrodes, things glowing hot. You turn off the ignition, the engine keeps running. The engine can run on that, and the carburetor doesn't know any better. It'll just emit fuel for all the air the engine draws. So the concept is that valve closes when you turn off the key, choking the flow so tightly that the engine just can't run on anyway. But I've added another one. See, this model of car didn't have this one. This is something they were using on other versions, earlier versions of this system, probably in 140s. I don't know if they ever did that on a 240. But the carburetors are the same, and there's just a plug in the body of the carburetor there. So I found one of these valves on an older carb in one of my parts bins, and I thought, hey, I've always wanted to have a little bit of a bump that I can just bump the idle speed up a bit for cold running, so that because as these carbs age, the relationship between the fuel enrichment and the idle up gets skewed. These don't have chokes. They've got a little lever that opens up a valve to admit extra gasoline into the metering circuit. So the idea was I'd like to have the engine running a little leaner than whatever the choke is trying to give it, but still idle it up in the cold weather. So I added this valve, and I've got a switch on the dashboard that turns this thing on and off. And I thought to myself, well, screw it. I bet you I could kludge together the wiring so that the switch on the dash, instead of turning the idle up valve on and off, turns the fuel pump. And the fuel pump is just hiding down there. There it is. And I figured I'd have to like get out the cutters and do a little bit of this and that, and I take a look under the hood and it's like, well, shit. All I had to do, I had one like this is the fuel pump one going here. I literally wired my fuel pump to the anti-run-on valve circuit because I mean it's on whenever the fuel pump would need to be on, and it provides enough current. So that's where that was. And then the wiring coming back from the switch for the idle up valve is this one here. Would have been going on that terminal. So all I had to do was just take the two and stick them together, and I pinched one of them to make it grab. And I drove back, and I had a lot of coordination, driving stick and paying enough attention to the engine to catch when it was about to choke off and die, flip the switch on for a moment. And the interesting thing is I found that I didn't really have to watch the character of the engine too closely. I could kind of just blindly give it about, I would say around 10% duty cycle or something like that. While I was driving along for most conditions, I was going like kind of on, off, on, off, on, off was about what I was doing. So that's maybe more than 10%, 20 or so. That did okay. And then coming up the hill, which was the more worrying part, up to here is quite a hill. I was finding, okay, well, it's working better if I run until I can feel it stumble. And you got to hit the switch quick, because as soon as it begins to stumble, it's about to actually lose power completely. As long as you have some momentum, that's not a big deal. You blip the switch and it goes. But, you know, anybody who has set up a float on a carb knows that the way that the emulsion tube in a carburetor works, it's very sensitive to the float level. And actually a lot of fueling errors that come up with carburetors where it's not really an egregious issue like a overflowing float bowl or something. A lot of that can come back to just incorrect setting of the float level. It'll really run you around because it'll change the linearity of the metering over the operating range of the carburetor. So it really wants to be at the right level. Just pointing that out for anyone who does try to work with carbs. This is stuff people all used to kind of know, but it's going by the wayside. It's an old art. But when your float ruptures, and for anyone who doesn't know what that is, there's maybe I'll do another video and show the insides of one of these carburetors. But in the bottom, there's a chamber that is supposed to stay about half full of gasoline, and there's a tube dipping down into it. That's the emulsion tube, and it draws fuel up and into the mixing area, the venturi, where it's mixed with air, atomized, and ingested by the engine. And the float is filled by the fuel pump, which can be either like you can see my old mechanical pump is still stuck on the side of the engine. That's this guy here. It failed. I just haven't bothered to remove it, so it's just sitting there doing nothing. But yeah, whether you have an electric or a mechanical pump, it's pushing fuel in there from the tank, and you can see there's fuel all over the outside of this. It obviously overflowed. There's just like in the back of your toilet, if you open the back of your reservoir on your toilet, most toilets anyway, there's a big plastic, or if it's really old, a brass bob in there on a rod. Some of them have like a concentric plastic ring around the fill tube, but those are more modern. But that floats in the water, or in the case of the carburetor, floats in the gasoline, and it shuts a valve that stops it from filling past a certain point. It sort of regulates the level. That's what's going on in the bottom there. And the floats, as they age, they're made of nylon. They do get a little bit brittle, and they eventually crack. And the crack can be so tiny, you never see it. You'll never find it unless you use pressure to look for it. But fuel will get into the float, and it stops floating. So it no longer closes the valve. And the pump is more than happy to just fill the thing right to the top and over. If you get a float that's totally full of gasoline and it's not floating at all, and a good flow on the fuel pump, you can actually have it where there's gasoline pissing out of the air filter box. It'll literally spray out of the intake end of the carb and through the vent and all over the place, and a portion of it is going raw gasoline right into the intake of the engine. It's not a good scene. It's also dangerous. This wasn't doing that. Like I said, it would still run, barely, and you'll notice this as you're driving. If a float ruptures like while you're driving, it's usually going to get slowly richer and richer because the float is filling up with gas. And when you shut down, by this point, things are kind of warm. The vapor or gas or whatever, I mean, like gaseous, not gasoline, whatever the vapor in the float is warm. It's going to cool down and it's actually going to suck fuel into the float. And I noticed exactly that symptom. It got richer and richer as I drove, parked the car until it cooled down, and then it was so rich it basically would not run. So I haven't even opened this up. I already know what it is. But yeah, I'm just really glad I figured a way to, I calmed down and figured a way to get myself home because I really did not feel like walking all the way out here and back for this tiny little plastic thing that I got to put into the, and it's messy to do because you're going to open the bottom of the carb and there's fuel pouring out of it, and it's just not a pleasant thing to do in a parking lot. So yeah, I'm going to take a break and then I'm going to fix this in the comfort of shop space with tools. Alrighty, there it is.